Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Week 1, Introduction to Game Design for the Game Theory and Innovative Game Design course. This PowerPoint is going to look at defining terms that are related to gaming. The terms in this particular PowerPoint are important, provide important background information. They may come up in future text readings or external readings, and oftentimes they actually form the foundation for some of the definitions that we're going to use in gaming and in game design. So to get started, you are starting a master's in mobile game design. Now what this is basically a software engineering degree with a focus on mobile gaming. The classes that you're taking, in addition to preparing you to create your own mobile game, can be used for some of the other careers and industries that we're going to be talking about here in these slides as well. The first slide that we're going to look at deals with play. And play is a very important concept in gaming because it is the interactive process whereby we engage the game. So it is, the player activity. In psychology and ethology, play is a range of voluntary, intrinsically motivated activities, normally associated with recreational pleasure and enjoyment. Play is most commonly associated with children and their juvenile level activities, but play can also be useful as an adult activity and occurs among other high-functioning animals as well. Many of the most prominent researchers in the field of psychology have viewed play as endemic to the human species. These psychologists have all had strong beliefs on how important play was on human development. Many of these psychologists believe that play was one of the best ways to learn, and that human beings actually learn by interacting with their environment. Many research methods were performed to prove their theories. Play is often interpreted as frivolous, yet the player can be intently focused on their objective, particularly when play is structured and goal-oriented as in a game. Accordingly, play can range from relaxed, free-spirited, and spontaneous, through frivolous, to planned or even compulsive activity. We're going to look at next one of the kind of founding fathers of play theory, Johann Huizinga. In 1949, he wrote a book called Homo Ludens, Man the Player. And he was looking at how play is an intrinsic human activity and is something that actually characterizes not only humans but other types of animals, and is something that we universally engage in. So because he is kind of one of the foundational writers and theorists that was exploring the idea of play, I want you as master's level students to be familiar with his writing in the original format. You're going to oftentimes see his name mentioned throughout the course in the textbook and in other people's writings, and it's good to be able to say, you know what, I read him, this is what he said, and be familiar from a first-person stance with what it is that he wrote, to either agree with it or disagree with it. Because he's the guy that kind of got the ball rolling, other researchers and theorists over the years have added to and built on his ideas and expanded on them, because sometimes people think that maybe Huizinga just didn't go far enough. So I'm going to let you guys evaluate his writing. I'd like you to read the foreword and the nature and significance of play as cultural phenomenon chapters from his book, which can be found online at the following URL. For discussion's sake, a couple of quotes from Huizinga. The first one comes from a secondary source, Schroeder, who wrote a very good article called Play Space Invaders, which we may or may not read a little bit later on in the class, depending on time. But Huizinga says that play is fundamental to all cultural institutions. He gives many examples to support that. And he additionally goes on to say that play is for itself. It serves no external goal. Play exists outside the scope of ordinary life. So it's something that we put, our common everyday routines on hold for in order to be able to play. Play operates within fixed boundaries of time and space and with its own set of rules. So while we are engaged in play, really that play subsumes the other activities that we're doing or takes the place of those other activities. And it has its own set of rules, so those rules may be significantly different than what we do in a normal environment. Play is layawell. Though it can completely absorb the player, ordinary life can reassert itself at any time. So you can see players kind of toggling back and forth between, their own ordinary everyday routines and play. We see this a lot actually in mobile gaming, where players may have a few moments, they whip out their smartphone and they pull up a game of Candy Crush and they play a couple rounds, whatever they can do, see if they can get to another level. And this may be while waiting in line. It may be a couple 30 seconds, or it may be a couple of minutes. Summing up the formal characteristics of play, Huizinga goes on to say, we might call it a free activity, standing quite consciously outside ordinary life, but not being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player intensely and utterly. It is an activity connected with no material interest, and no profit can be gained by it. It proceeds within its own proper boundaries of time and space according to fixed rules and in an orderly manner. It promotes the formation of social groupings that tend to surround themselves with secrecy and to stress the difference from the common world by disguise or other means. So, some things that are important in this last quote, especially in the last sentence of this, is the formation of social groupings, because we definitely see that play, when it's incorporated into gaming, has this characteristic. You can see this especially in role-playing games, where players may identify themselves with a specific group. In first-person shooters, again, either from a personality standpoint or from a social grouping, players may self-identify themselves as first-person shooters and seek out like peers in order to be able to associate. So you oftentimes see people forming their social groupings around leisure activities. And this is specifically very common today with gaming. Although it's a holdover from historical situations where you may have a group of people that get together on weekends to play bridge before gaming and may form their social grouping around that gameplay as well. Another set of ideas that's closely related to gaming and specifically will come up as we begin to define what is a game later on, are the idea of open and closed systems. We're going to look at two main types of systems here. This is focusing on a social science definition, but it really applies to systems in general. Open systems are systems that allow interactions between the internal elements and the environment. An open system is defined as a system in exchange of matter with its environment, presenting import and export, building up and breaking down of its material components. A good example of an open system would be a human being interacting with their environment. We cannot be studied necessarily as a closed system, because even though what we define as a human being is closely bounded by what takes place underneath our skin, the bones and the nerves and the muscles and blood and all of that, we still constantly are interacting with our environment, taking in air, letting out carbon dioxide, and interacting in other ways as well. So we're an open system. Closed systems, on the other hand, are held to be isolated from their environment. Oftentimes, physical systems that may be associated with physics or the physical environment can be fully closed systems, although these are somewhat difficult to encounter completely. Equilibrium thermodynamics is one example as a field of study that applies to closed systems. Open systems really is where there's a lot of research going on. It's what helped further develop the idea of systems theory. And because you've got a system that's interacting with its environment, or a system that may be interacting with other systems, you end up with complex systems theory, how different systems interact with each other. And this is going to be important as we go into our definitions here. You can see from a visual standpoint, this maybe explains a little better what's going on. You've got the boundaries of the system that contain how it's interacting, but an open system has exchange of information with the environment. So it's a little bit more difficult to completely research or capture what's going on in this system because it's constantly changing and it's interacting with its environment. So these types of systems are associated often with much more complex behavior. Closed systems, on the other hand, really are completely bounded. We can research and investigate what's going on here because the information that's happening is contained completely. It doesn't necessarily need to interact with the external environment. There doesn't need to be an exchange of information. And gaming oftentimes is associated as a closed system. You've got, a set of rules that are coming into play. You've got, the mechanics and the dynamics of that. And so long as the player is part of that closed system, we don't necessarily need to concern ourselves with what's going on in the environment around us. And we can draw the boundaries completely around what's going on here. Okay, the idea of systems takes us into the next topic, which is modeling. What a model is a schematic description of a system, theory, or phenomenon that accounts for its known or inferred properties and may be used for further study of its characteristics. And that's from the freedictionary.com. One of the best ways for us to understand systems and what are happening in systems is to create a model. And this is important because oftentimes many of the systems that we're interested as humans in studying are very complex. And they are too complex for us to research in and of themselves, or they may be too small or too big. Many of you have had the experience with creating a model of the solar system when you were in grade school. You took styrofoam balls and created the sun and the earth and the moon and stuck them all together with toothpicks or some other means of keeping them together. Well, that's a model. It's an overly simplistic representation of what was actually going on. It didn't take into account asteroids or meteors or quasars or the expansion of the universe. It just helped you as a child to be able to understand what that system was doing. And so models can be useful to that extent. However, one of the things we want to keep in perspective with models, and this is nicely summarized by George Box, is that essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And what he means by this is that when we create a model that represents a system, it's an oversimplification. So we are specifically choosing to represent some characteristics and to exclude other characteristics. So long as the characteristics that we choose to include are fundamental to whatever process it is that we're interested in observing, the model can be valid, can have some meaning, and can help to inform. One of the things to keep into account is that games are models of systems. And usually a game is an idealized model of some sort of a environment or a representation. When I say that, a good example of what I mean by that is that the gameplay, the mechanics of the game have to be structured in such a way to permit ongoing interaction and ongoing involvement. You may start a game and you may play through it to a finish and to an end point and it closes, but you also should be able to go back and pick that game up and play through it again. You may not find the same type of enjoyment playing through it again, but it should allow you to start and stop and start and restart as you go. The reason this is important, say for instance, as a difference between how modeling is used in gaming and how it is used in, say, real-world simulations, an economics model that's part of a game needs to be able to be self-sustaining. So if you're modeling an economic system in a game, you have to have ways, mechanics that are involved in redistributing the wealth, so that there's constantly whatever the value is uh, associated in the game, that it comes up and is accessible to players over time. This is different than many economic simulations that model the real world, where over time the wealth tends to concentrate in certain areas and reaches an equilibrium point, so that maybe there's less actual exchange of whatever it is of value between who the participants in the system are. And so that's a difference between using a model to represent an actual system in a simulated environment, and how we might create an idealized version of that model in a game environment to sustain play over time. I wanted you to, as part of the idea of modeling, to read Joshua Epstein's article on why model. He lists out about 10 different reasons why we want to create models, and this is important just to take into consideration as we go through the rest of the readings in the textbook and when modeling comes up as part of game design. So I mentioned the difference between using a model in an idealized system situation for a game and using a model for a simulation. So let's look at the idea of simulation here. Simulation is the imitation of the operation of a real-world process or system over time. The act of simulating something first requires that a model be developed. This model represents the key characteristics or behaviors or functions of the selected physical or abstract system or process. The model represents the system itself, whereas the simulation represents the operation of the system over time, more concerned, say, with the process. Simulation is used in many contexts, such as simulation of technology for performance optimization, safety engineering, testing, training, education, and video games. Often, computer experiments are used to study simulation models. Simulation is also used with scientific modeling of natural systems or human systems to gain insight into their functioning. Simulations can be used to show the eventual real effects of alternative conditions and courses of action. Simulation is also used when the real system cannot be engaged because it may not be accessible, or it may be dangerous or unacceptable to engage, or it is being designed but not yet built, or it may simply not exist. Key issues in simulation include acquisition of valid source information about the relevant selection of key characteristics and behaviors, the use of simplifying approximations and assumptions within the simulation, and fidelity and validity of the simulation outcomes. When we look at section 5 for this week, we are going to cover genres of game, and one of the things you'll see is that simulation is a known genre in gaming. You may have played SimCity, which is a sandbox type game that allows you to create your own city and set the parameters for that and run it and kind of see whether or not your city thrives or whether it turns into a ghetto, or you can go in and constantly interact and adjust the parameters as you go. So that's the example of a simulation that's also considered to be a game because it's mainly designed for open, fun play. Simulations are a growing a growing industry, especially in the military, for training. We oftentimes have situations where you may have very expensive equipment such as tanks, helicopters, or stealth fighters that are limited, provide limited access to military personnel who need to train on them. So it's much easier to create some sort of a physical simulation that's easily accessible and allow them to train on that. And as the definition mentioned, what we want to do specifically there is to make sure that the characteristics that we choose in the simulation are highly representative of the objectives that we have for training. If we're looking at training someone on a tank, we probably want the physical system, the control panels and everything to look very similar to the tank. So we want to achieve high visual and physical fidelity for that system. For other systems where our goals change, we may need to adjust the intensity of the visual and physical fidelity. There was an example of using simulation training to train um, submarine crew personnel on fires. And you can imagine that you may run fire drills on a sub, but it's probably not practical to do a lot of actual fire related, start a fire or have a simulated fire on an actual sub. So if you can have crews do monthly testing where they're playing a video game like game that reminds them what the process is in case of an emergency or a fire on the sub, that's a lot more practical and may keep them on their toes. Problem with that was that they initially created the simulation with a high degree of physical and visual fidelity. But submarines vary, and the crew oftentimes fixated on the fact that the door in the simulation wasn't in the right place, or there was a pipe overhead that wasn't there, or that was there. And instead of being able to focus on what the emergency procedures in the simulation were getting at. So the developers of that simulation went back and they adjusted it so that the video that was associated was much more cartoon-like, more 2D than 3D. And immediately the crew that was playing through the simulation was able to internalize the fact that the environment was cartoonized, was a caricature of the real environment. And so they discounted that. They didn't focus as much on that or obsess about that as much, and they were better able to focus on what the actual goal of the simulation was, which was the safety training. So keep that in mind in your game. Although we see a lot of games right now that are pursuing the holy grail of absolute 3D, high intensity HD graphics, this may not be what makes your game fun or what engages players the most. And even though smartphone technology today has evolved so that we can run HD graphics in real time on our phones, it still does eat up battery. It still does perhaps take resources from other functions on the phone, and you want to take that into consideration with your game as to whether or not it's an absolute necessity that you have high fidelity graphics, or maybe you can scale things back and still achieve a fun and engaging environment for the players, and also maybe make something that's a little bit faster and easier for you to turn around. Many of you may be familiar already with the idea of modeling and simulation and what it's used for. I'd still like you to go in and watch this quick video that shows kind of a foundational level of how we create models and simulation of what kind of currently is going on in the industry. This is a growing field, and while gaming is also growing, you are in a master's program that actually should allow you or prepare you to work in both industries. So if you get out and you graduate and you may think you're going to work for a game design company, you may actually find that you end up working in modeling and simulation for the Department of Defense or one of the defense contractors, because there's a lot of jobs actually there as well. Or you might even be doing simulations for courtroom cases showing accidents. A lot of this has pretty significant similarities with gaming. And the last topic that we want to look at in this set of slides is artificial intelligence. Hopefully this is a concept that you're fairly familiar with from your undergraduate. You may have taken a course or two in this. You may or may not be using artificial intelligence in your game, and that's okay. The sophistication may also vary. If you're doing any sort of situation, though, in which the player is competing against the computer, you probably need to take a little bit of this into consideration. Artificial intelligence plays a significant role in modeling and simulation and in authentic gameplay. What we mainly want to be concerned with here, at least in this slide, because we will look at AI later on in some specific instances in the textbook, I want you to be familiar with the three main approaches that have been used to improve AI over the years. This these specific 3 ones here are according to Yijin Zhang, but other researchers have looked at this as well. AI is a way of modeling or representing or simulating natural human intelligence. So it's a way of using computer hardware, programming, computer systems, digital environments, networks, in order to be able to achieve the best representation we can of how humans think and behave. The reason we're looking at these 3 approaches is because they come up a lot in philosophy, and they will be mentioned in some of the outside articles that we are reading. They may be mentioned at a later point in the textbook, and I want you to have a little bit of a background in what each of these approaches means and what kind of the philosophy or the philosophical approach is. So the first is the structuralism approach. This approach is oftentimes used when we are using computer systems to be able to help us better understand how the human brain functions and how humans behave. So this is a computerized way of maybe understanding cognitive science and psychology. Its main focus is on simulating the structural characteristics of the biological neural networks in the human brain. So we may actually link together a bunch of circuits in an attempt to try to model how neurons and neural networks in the brain work. We may create a robotic arm that uses servos and hydraulic systems or other ways of opening and closing the fingers and modeling how muscles may contract. So we're actually trying to go back and represent as much as we're able using computerized systems, what the structure, the physical structure of our body or our brain is. And then that helps us to be able to better understand how our brain and how our body functions. Okay, so that's more of the structuralist approach. It's concerned with representing outcomes, but it believes that outcomes should be closely modeled by the actual internal structure of the computerized system that we're using as well. The second one is the functionalism approach, and that simulates the functional processes of logical human thinking, but it's not as concerned with how that arises. So this is more of a black box approach. We're not really concerned what's going on inside the box. We're mostly concerned with the outcome. So we're not actually looking at how circuits may interact with each other in a similar way to, say, nerves. We might use clever algorithms or clever implementations of programming that trick people into believing that the computer is behaving in a human-like manner. This is fairly strongly associated with Alan Turing's approach to examining artificial intelligence. His Turing test basically said how a measure of artificial intelligence is how much a computer can trick a human into believing that the computer is a fellow human being or is behaving in a human-like manner. Chat boxes oftentimes use this approach. And the third approach is behaviorism. This one mimics the behavior relationship in solving problems by some intelligent beings, either human or animals. And the foundation of this comes from behavioral psychology. You may be familiar with people like B.F. Skinner and his ideas on behaviorism, kind of using approach to training rats to be able to drink out of a water bottle or dogs to be able to salivate if they're given food. Our interest in the behavioristic approach will come probably, you'll see this used a little bit in week 2, where we examine compulsion loops and types of programming that can cause, humans to be able to want to play over and over and over again, looking for some sort of reward. And it's using probability and statistics to be able to um, encourage humans to keep playing. And that ends this session of PowerPoints.